We talked about the state of the DPS results in the Mythic raid testing of patch 11.1 in the PTR, so now we're talking about the results of the healers, freshly updated from the Mythic raid testing of a few days ago. No, this time we're not putting the average at the end, now we have it right at the beginning for the results of all of the specs, just to show exactly how the healing specs have been doing in the raid. So now we're going to be looking at them one by one to see, number one, if you are on Copium, some of these might be due to bugs, due to problems still not fixed in the specs. Maybe the opposite, some of these specs are doing too well because of a bug as well, or maybe just because the situation right now doesn't look too good for certain specs or too nice for others. So the first in line that we're starting with, and not necessarily because it's at the moment overall the clear bottom result in the PTR, it's Holy Paladin. So the first thing about Holy Paladin is that it's not actually changing a lot in 11.1. So we're also starting from Holy Paladin because not much is happening worth talking about, which is perhaps doubly funny or doubly sad when you go back to the tuning that is coming in 11.1 and you see that, after all, Holy Paladin does have a reasonable amount of changes coming for them. There were a few changes, particularly around the behaviors of your choices when you are hard casting both Flash of Light and Holy Light to make, for example, Infusion of Light less powerful for your flash heal, so you can use it more liberally without having it to be based on your buffs, and then as a result Holy Light have a lot of power more and not nearly as much to your Inflorescence of the Sun, which is still not something Holy Paladins care about too much because the hard casting way of playing Holy Paladin has not been, number one, a very liked style of playing Paladin, and number two, a not very powerful way of playing Holy Paladin. Besides these though, most of these changes like these, for example, are not actually very impactful for the spec. What was more impactful was the continued nerf of Lifesmith, the continued nerf of your Avenging Crusader heal by doing damage playstyle, which is what you have been using, right now in live. You are still using right now as a Holy Paladin, which is, at the very least, for the moment in the testing of the PTR, going away. Way more Holy Paladins, in fact most of the Holy Paladins testing the raid bosses were back playing with Herald of the Sun, which is not, actually receiving any changes. It's not that any of this is particularly changing the way you are playing now that you're back with Herald of the Sun. You're still focusing most of your holy power in a very simple Holy Shock, Judgment into single target heal. Holy Shock and Judgment into a single target heal. Every once in a while you can use Crusader Strike in melee if you want. It's not necessary. Then if you can keep track of your buffs of Unending Light, you can stack them up to max and also use Light of Dawn every once in a while, but most of the time you will just be using these two buttons over and over, and that's how you play. So it's a bit disappointing because the playstyle is not particularly engaging, and doubly disappointing because right now it's not that Holy Paladin is doing that well in the PTR. So that's the first sadness when it comes to the state of the specs. It's Holy Paladin and the raid results right now being quite poor, without also not getting any particularly positive changes in the PTR either. Now, talking about PTR changes, it's a bit awkward because now we're talking about Resto Shaman, and no, we're not talking about Resto Shaman because it's starting from the bottom right after Holy Paladin. It's because, much like Holy Paladin, is also receiving quite few changes from their current build in live. When you go to Shaman in the PTR and you start seeing, Elemental is kind of skipped to be fair, but then you see the massive changes going for enhancement, and then it's time to look at the changes to Resto Shaman. And again, similar to Holy Paladin, you might think there are some positive changes here and there. There actually aren't. There are some talents moved around here and there, like Healing Tide Totem is back closer up in your talent tree, and now Mana Tide turns into an extra buff that you gain when you put down Healing Tide Totem. So they basically cooked two totems into one. When you move from the typical live build of Resto Shaman into 11.0, you have some breaking down of talents because, of course, some of the talents have been moved around, but in general, it's the same. You can still take Healing Tide Totem now that it's here instead of being here. For example, Mana Tide Totem is gone here. It becomes a passive for Healing Tide, etc, etc, but pretty much everything else about the build remains the same. There have been already some decent QL changes we have mentioned before, like Surging Totem being buffed, now costing like 30% less mana, which is very valuable because Resto Shaman is losing their tier set, their current tier set in 11.1, so their Chain Heal is back to costing 8% more mana. But in terms of these results, what was more visible in the Resto Shaman results in the PTR was very simply that nothing really changed. Even taking one of pretty much their better results, the Rick River fight, which is also slightly more relevant than the other results because this fight was like a 5-ish minute fight in the PTR. How far players were able to go in the fight itself. It was quite a long fight compared to the usual 2-3 minutes of testing in other bosses. So this one was a bit more relevant to see how healers would continue to heal throughout the fight. And Resto Shaman in this fight was doing quite well. And what you can see from all of these Resto Shaman logs is that practically the same things are happening. The same buttons, the same style of healing that you have been seeing now in live is continuing in 11.1, even down to basically what you are casting, what you are prioritizing. It's still the same. It's still Riptide and Chain Heal. You use Unleash Life every 15 seconds for your Chain Heal. Most of the time, you play around Healing Stream Totem over playing with Cloudburst. Basically the same things happening in live. So you're not getting any meaningful changes, even with the little notes you have gotten in the PTR with some talents being moved around. Nothing really actually is changing the way you play. Yes, we have made a video about this. We still have the Hopium angle of a completely unorthodox build playing around Whispering Waves, playing with Farseer and around Healing Wave, but for now, even after being buffed slightly from 10 to 15% of your healing wave healing being spread around, it's still not really a thing in the PTR, and the results have been middling to mediocre. Now, Resto Shaman is decent in the long run, so when you start going to a 4, 5, 6 minute long test might end up being better. You know, maybe some of these healers, for example, might end up showing up better in shorter logs because they just pop their huge cooldowns, for example, and they show off much more than Resto Shaman, who has cooldowns, but he can spread them more throughout the fight. It's not like a rewind of an Evoker, for example, or even Ultimate Penitence of a Discipline Priest, etc, etc. Maybe that could be a cope angle, but for now, also the results on top of the spec itself not changing really much at all. It has not done too well right now. Now, I guess the theme of today is the not changing too much, because the next in line is Resto Druid. Resto Druid has been doing middlingly average in the results, or very simply just fine in the results. Also, Resto Druid is practically not changing. If you go from the live build of Resto Druid over to the 11.1 build, it's the same build. Yes, of course, the General 3 is now broken because that's what's being changed in 11.1, but for the playstyle of Resto Druid itself, not much is changing. We have talked about this. We have gone over the mastery, the mastery change of Resto Druid, which should technically make it stronger in the raid, should make it easier and more efficient for your HOTS value, giving it a 30% higher value up front and then reduced the value for each additional overtime effect, because of course in the raid you have 20 players to spread your HOTS to. It's not that you can put Life Bloom and Cenarion Ward and Efflorescence and Reju and Regrowth and Wild Growth on every single player. You can do it much more easily in Mythic Plus, where you have fewer players, fewer targets, and you can put way more HOTS on them compared to the raid. But in the raid, it's harder. So it's better to have your mastery be 30% stronger, to have only maybe a couple of HOTS on your entire raid, whether it is Efflorescence on the ground and a Reju on them and a Wild Growth or even a Regrowth on them. It's better to have it 30% stronger up front and then lose value for having 4 or 5 HOTS on the target, because it's not going to happen as often in the raid. So it should have been a pretty good buff for the raid results. Now, as we've just seen, the raid results have been pretty middling, but nothing too bad or too ugly. It's just okay. Not that the playstyle is changing after all. You're still playing Resto Druid. You're still playing Resto Druid with, we have also talked about this, a massively empowered value on your regrowth, which now pretty much mogs rejuvenation both in its hot value and of course in its initial heal, since Reju doesn't have an initial heal, and also destroys rejuvenation in mana cost, because with your abundance talent in the raid you're practically getting a free of cost regrowth as well. So it's just an overall much better ability now to be able to use, and that's just what you see in the raid. Just a bunch of rejuves and a bunch of regrowth. Every once in a while you do the Swiftmend Wild Growth combo. Grove Guardians popped out as well for extra healing. Time together your Flourish and your Convoke in, healing periods. Depending on your timings, that's remained the same. It's basically the same as before with two positives. Your Mastery now works better in the raid, and then the second positive, now your General tree is much better. Overall, speaking about raid value, you can become more tanky. You now have an easier interrupt if it's necessary in the raid as well. These are kind of the two positives. Maybe even some slightly more, maybe not even tank healing, like squishy DPS that you can put this on in the raid as well. Those would be the positives for Resto Druid. No, if you're talking about some, massively OP right now, some OP combo you can have in the raid, some top HPS, that's not what we saw in the results in the PTR. Now, talking about something that we skipped after Paladin and Shaman, and then after to Druid, it was Evoker, mostly because we had an entire video about this. This is the Evoker, and this is the Evoker, and what changes is that one is playing with Engulf and one is playing with Chrono Warden. We have mentioned all of the juicy QOLs Preservation has gotten, will get in this 11.1 patch. Not necessarily about buffs themselves, but simply about having always Dream Breath being cast on yourself, which makes it super easy to know the target of Engulf, now that you yourself will always have the Dream Breath on you, for example, to have also Emerald Blossom no longer be echoed, and your Emerald Blossom no longer breaking your echo combos that you were having, possibly allowing for more Emerald Blossom play in the raid. But these are all positives. Right now in the testing we haven't actually seen any Emerald Blossom play. Most of the Evokers are still defaulting to what they already know. It's also very visible, the playstyle, just by looking at the healing throughput. You can see this one is more consistent. There are more bumps of healing with shorter, smaller, of course, also 2 million-ish bumps of healing, and then you move over to Engulf, and there are way more peaks. They are more spread. There are more flat periods of healing when you're not doing nearly as much as this, but the peaks go much higher because, of course, of your Engulf burst. This is staying the same so far in the raid. The results weren't that great, but then again, let's not get too focused on the results themselves, due to, as mentioned, many of these results only being 2 to 3 minutes long. So it's harder to gauge the value, especially when you see some of the results being very good, some of the results being very bad. It means, it might be up and down, it might be based on the fight, based on how short the fight was in the testing, etc, etc. It would be more worrying, for example, if the results were always all bad, rather than being, in and out, up and down, like we have seen now for Preservation Evoker, or even for Restoration Druid. So still nothing too bad to worry about when it comes to Preservation. They have pretty good QOL changes to make them more interesting to play in 11.1 in the raid, with more possible options. Yes, there is still the option that Engulf continues to be by far the strongest choice. So screw playing Chrono Warden, screw playing with Blossom and all that stuff, and continue to play exactly like you've been playing in live right now. But at least you have the option to play as something different. Now, talking about, just like we said, if you see something always being kind of low down in numbers, maybe that's where you can get a little bit worried. You could be saying the same about Mistweaver, who has overall gotten very consistent results and wasn't in the bottom pretty much in any of these results. That's the positive we have right now. The overall, very close, to be fair. All these four are within 4% healing. These are basically within 1%, and this is about 3.5% above them. So again, we're talking about, even if you're looking purely at the results, these four were very, very close to each other. Now, while we do have also the entire video about what is changing between 11.0.7, 11 live version of Monk and then the 11.1 patch version of Monk, yes, there is some QL, yes, there are some positive, although they were more focused on your fist weaving style, your being able to heal even without having multiple enemies by doing damage, but still benefiting from the same amount of healing even if you were fighting one target, more value on being able to have a single target version of Shaman's Gift, which is more valuable for utility, for spot healing and not for big wide HPS numbers. So many of these good QLs coming with these Monk changes in 11.1 weren't necessarily to straight up making them stronger, first of all, in the raid, in terms of raid healing, raid-wide healing, and more importantly, it's not that they were any of these, it's not that they were going to drastically change the way Monk plays, which is what you also see in here in their playstyle. It is still the same cast-centric, no fist weaving style of Monk play in the raid. Vivify, Enveloping Mist, Renewing Mist, and keeping up your Rushing Wind Kick buff. That's still the same, practically the same way you are playing even in 11.1, despite, as mentioned, the numbers being quite nice for Mistweaver and the results being quite good. The playstyle has remained the same for Mistweaver. No changes to the talent tree either, besides the Shaman's Gift Swapperoo down the right side, so there also nothing is changed. It's just that for the moment the numbers have been very promising, both in the raid and in Mythic Plus. That's why there is more attention around Mistweaver for the release of 11.1. Talking about the attention being given, there's definitely been some being given to priests in 11.1 because the tuning, the balance tuning changes for 11.1 were quite hefty for both Holy and Discipline. You know, we have the changes to Discipline right over here, and then we also have the changes to Holy right over here. So there is quite a lot of them. Now, what is perhaps a bit hilarious is the fact that despite all of these changes to Holy Priest and this idea of bringing back this AoE style of play, this is the current build of Holy Priest in live, you move to 11.1 and it all gets destroyed because there is a whole bunch of talent changes, Circle of Healing is dead, all of the power of that AoE healing is now in Prayer of Healing, and the follow-up talents as well will be centered around Prayer of Healing, and that is what Blizzard was trying to encourage priests doing more. So reintroducing some kind of AoE heal ability back into their rotation compared to what we are used seeing now, which is still not gone completely now. Even in the latest round of testing from a few days ago, you still had quite a few Holy Priest players still refusing to play with Prayer of Healing and still sticking with what they are doing now in live, which is basically just Flash Heal, Serenity, and Mending. That's it. That's how you play. So that is still something that they're trying to do over the newer play style of reintroducing an actual AoE ability into your rotation. Obviously, there might be bosses and bosses. There might be bosses that require better spot healing. You might have your healing comp with big, chunky AoE healers, like maybe an Evoker or maybe even a Discipline Priest. So the Holy Priest might be better at doing single target healing. Maybe there are bosses that will require better AoE healing, so you move over to Prayer of Healing. So even if this were the case, even if you were moving over to Prayer of Healing, it would still be good to know that you can continue to play the current playstyle of Holy Priest, which is more single target abilities focused, and still be good, because that can also have its values in the raid. So overall, with all these changes, it's a net positive for Holy Priest. They're continuing doing well with their current build, and then the changes to the talents have simply given them an extra avenue of playing the build, playing more around your Holy Words. Also now, again, your AoE Holy Word, your Sanctify, no longer just your Serenity. So it's also good for that, for Holy Priest. There is also, though, another spec doing well, which is Discipline. You see that they bounce around between poor results towards the bottom and much better results. You know, it's typical of a spec. We also mention this every time we look at this kind of testing. Specs that require more proactiveness. So specs that require the 10 to 15 second ramp window to set their damage or their healing preparation for the big heal. So Preservation, Discipline Priest, in some cases even Resto Druid of course, those tend to be a bit worse in testing because they need more time and more prep to do well compared to a more reactive healer, like for example Holy Paladin and Resto Shaman, which in this example doesn't bode too well because the two reactive healers were the ones doing the worst. But it might still be bait. We touched on this already. You can see Discipline here having its worst results in the longest testable bosses. Basically, the bosses that don't last a couple of minutes, where you can dump your Evangelism, your Ultimate Penitence, your PI, and your CDs in the first big damage event and then wipe because it's testing, where you're having good results, are much different than the bosses that last much longer and you were one of the worst ones. Because that's when you have to start spreading your CDs, knowing when to use them, etc, etc. And if you're not that sure about these type of things, you end up doing much worse. So, of course, obvious healing profile of a Discipline Priest, especially if you're playing still Void Weaver in the PTR. You have, as mentioned, the massive spikes of healing because you dump everything and then the fight lasts for 6 minutes and you don't heal nearly as much as you do. Instead, now you have a 3-minute fight, so it's much easier to spread your CDs around in a 3-minute fight, and the results are very good. There are some interesting things where, unlike what we have seen for the entirety of the first part of this expansion, there were more attempts at testing Oracle for Discipline, which was unheard of until basically a few days ago, because since the beginning of this expansion, Oracle has been completely dead for Discipline. So even just seeing it more in testing is pretty good to see, because this is getting a bit boring, to be fair. Despite all of the changes Discipline is getting in 11.1, they're actually not changing the way they play that much. If you go from live to 11.1, yes, of course, you're getting a bunch of talents being broken, but not that many. There is not a lot of changes over here. If you wanted to play like you were before, you're practically still able to. The only difference is that you have lost your Rapture. You lost your extra ramp window with Rapture, and now you have a 4-minute Ultimate Penitence. But for the rest, if you wanted to play like you were before, you are still able to in this playstyle. You know, every 90 seconds you have Evangelism and you do your ramp. That's still a thing that can work in the PTR. For me, particularly, slightly going a bit more in detail, talking about, you know, the value of the spec in this upcoming tier, Discipline is still in danger of inevitably having to go and fight for a spot with Preservation, because Flame Shaper is doing what Discipline, Flame Shaper is doing this as well. The problem is Flame Shaper can do this better, can do this more often, and also requiring much less ramp, much less setup time, because for an Evoker is basically 3 to 4 GCDs, for a Discipline Priest is like 14, so that's also a problem for Discipline. So that's perhaps the more worrying part for Discipline, less so about their current results. Also, the fact that Holy Priest is also doing well can be a problem for Discipline. So that is what I would be more worried about, rather than the actual results of Discipline so far in the raid testing. What I'd be actually worried about is Holy Paladin. I'm not even that worried about Resto Shaman. Actually, I feel like the deeper the fights go, the better it was doing. That's a good sign. Whereas Holy Paladin didn't really have anything particularly to be excited about. So that's perhaps the more disappointing one of the results so far in the PTR testing when it comes to raid results. So in an interesting, possibly deja vu-esque, because getting into this outlook is very reminiscent of Dragonflight Season 3 Mirjosil, where Holy Priests, Discipline Priests, Mistweaver Monks were amongst the more played specs in the raid, which is kind of what we are seeing here doing the better in terms of results. We will see how this will continue. Of course, by now we have seen multiple rounds of balance tuning coming, and presumably we are still a few weeks away from the release, not just the release of the patch, but then the release of the tier itself. So there will be more tuning coming. We will see what will be impacted by this tuning. But for today, this was the recap of how things have been going when it comes to healers in the PTR testing of the raid in this new patch cycle. So with this out of the way, on this Sunday, it is now time to leave each other. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, 34 unedited minutes. How do I end up making a 7 specs video longer than the entirety of the DPS one?